Okay, we're going to go ahead and start. Good evening, everyone. Before we start the program, I'd like to make a few housekeeping announcements. First of all, my name is Randy Sabato. I'm the husband of the late Jerry Lowe Sabato. Let's see. In terms of the housekeeping items, masks are recommended. Please turn off your cell phones. Please do not record this presentation. The bathrooms are located in the back to the left. Before I introduce the speaker, I'd like to introduce State Controller Betty Yee. She's standing right up here. Betty? You want to say something? Okay.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. I don't want to take too much away from the program, but I just wanted to acknowledge what a wonderful time this is that we're gathered here tonight because of all of your involvement, interest, grassroots activism on just writing a chapter of history that has long been reflected upon, but for many of the descendants of those who really were a part of this community so long ago and created really a presence here in terms of the Chinese American community. This is really a special time, and we're seeing this momentum really throughout this country with respect to righting these past wrongs. And so we're really excited to hear from Sandy tonight, who's just really the historian extraordinaire of the Central Coast here. And but the one thing I will say is this, particularly during a time when the Asian American community has been victims of tremendous hate. I can't say how much it means to all of us that you're here tonight, to be sitting here in solidarity and allyship, to really help us be a part of re-owning and reclaiming this part of our history. It just means so much to us. So really on a personal note, thank you to all of you for being here, and I look forward tomorrow to really being part of the Walk of Remembrance, where we really are going to have our feet in the shoes of those who came before us. So thank you all very much for being here.
Thank you, Betty. So before again we start, I'd like to start off by asking the descendants of the village to please stand up. Come on, I know you're out there. Please stand up. Okay. All right. The other thing is I'd personally like to thank the Pacific Grove Museum staff for helping us put this event on. So the director of the Pacific Grove Museum is Carla Bitter. She's right over there. And if there are any other staff from the museum, if you could please stand up also. All right, thank you, Lisa. Okay, thank you all for attending tonight's event. When we first started to put this program together to celebrate Asian American Pacific Island Heritage Month and to remember and honor the Point Alonis, Point Almaeus villagers, the first person, at least that came to my mind, to talk about the village and the Chinese history here in Monterey Bay is our guest speaker tonight. It is my honor and privilege to introduce to you Sandy Lydon. He's also been called the history dude, the weather dude. I didn't know this about Sandy, but apparently in the late 1980s, he had a weekly half-hour show on KCBA Channel 35, and it was called In Your Backyard. It featured local, regional history stuff. He was also at one point the weather anchor for KCBA. So I can see that. I think he has a weatherman's voice here and personality. So a little bit about Sandy. He was an educator for 50 years. I think he still considers himself an educator. He's a historian emeritus from at Cabrillo College, where he taught Asian American history. He's led trips to China, Mongolia, Serbia, Southeast Asia, Tibet, Ireland, and the United Kingdom. He's written books on the history of Asian immigrants to the Monterey Bay area, including Japanese in the Monterey Bay region and the award-winning Chinese Gold. So please help me welcome Mr. Sandy Lydon, the dude.
So he doesn't look that old, does he? A couple of bouquets, and one is, this. This. Every community would kill to have this. The Chautauqua Hall, this is, how this hasn't, maybe I shouldn't be saying this, but how it hasn't burned down already is a miracle. From the 80s, from the 1880s, just think of all the things. I know, and you notice the no smoking signs are very prominent all around the building, and I understand why. And it's beautifully maintained. It is just sweet. And whatever you think about the Chautauqua Society, you might want to rethink it anyway, because you probably haven't got it quite straight. And I'll just insert that. The Feast of Lanterns originally came from the Chautauqua Society from New York, and it came out here. And the Chautauqua Society was an educational organization primarily. And if you look back at the positions they took on certain things like Chinese exclusion and some of the bigger issues of the time, they're on the right side of it, yeah, I can say that, the right side of it. They were an educational organization. And I think there's been some unfortunate things. We've got to let the history breathe. We're not letting the history breathe. It's like we've got to slow down and listen. And that's part of what I'm hoping you'll do. This is to remind me that I have no clue about what I'm going to do. I have a thing I do sometimes to pin an audience. I don't have to do that here. So here's the deal. Your compass is screwed up. It just is. If you find yourself saying phrases like the Far East, for me, Far East is Delaware. It's all wrong. Because for the people about whom we're going to be speaking this evening, we're the Far East. See, you look at see this? See, if you need to know which way is which, and that's where immigrant people, from other states, there aren't many of those these days. Most of them are going the other way. I'm not saying thank goodness, but they're leaving. So the general orientation is that the ocean is west. So the guy sets up and he's going to take his girlfriend for a picnic on the beach. And he wants her to see the sunset. And so he goes out and he puts the blankets and he puts all the stuff, course, you don't do it on this side of the bay because you won't be able to see the sunset because it's foggy all the time. But so you go to the other side of the bay, the sunny side of the bay, and you put the thing on the beach and you wait, and as you're facing the ocean, the sun sets over here, and you look like a fool. Well, you are. The ocean isn't always west of where you are. And the story that you hear about the migration in the United States is that go west, and the covered wagon comes up to the beach or to the cliff, and Ma, we're here, and it's all moving this way. This story comes the other direction, the different direction, and I cannot think of a culture that is more different than the culture coming across than the one that comes across the Sundown Sea. I use this map to remind you, and oh, look. So that was a tarantula, by the way, and I worked hard on that. So China's over there, right? And you are somewhere over here, all right? Now, when I say to you, and people have said it a lot, that they came directly from China by sea, you look at that and go, holy mackerel, that's a long way. It is. It is. Next. But the perspective you need to have, and it's wonderful, he checked through and he said, are you sure you want slide number 2 to be upside down? He thought it was an error. No, it's intentional. First of all, it's almost impossible to find a map that is Pacific-centered, because most maps are centered on Greenwich. No one cares about Greenwich. I certainly don't. All right? But what Greenwich does is it splits the Pacific in half. And so you don't get a chance to see it all together, right? And then it's a Mercator projection which focuses your eye about in the middle, but if you turn it over, all of a sudden you notice something. Well, because I'm going to show you. You may not have noticed it. But it is possible to sail and almost entirely in the sight of land from Asia to North America. But the problem is that the emphasis is always the other way. If you look at it this way, then you're supposed to say, oh, so good, okay, that's close. You're almost not passing the first test here. All right, so here's the way it worked. There's a book. This book, nice gentleman named Hans von Tilburg, the first thing I did is I sent, we discussed this by email, Walter van Tilburg Clark, English professor at the University of Nevada, Reno, wrote the best, absolutely best book that exists about lynchings. It's called the Oxbow Incident. It is to die for, pardon the pun. It is a major book. It was made into a film in the 40s. And so I was captivated by his name. I said, Van Tilburg. He said, we Dutchmen got around a lot. And so, no, he's not related, but he's Dutch. The book is Chinese Junks on the Pacific. That book, too. It's a story. And what he did was he studied the maritime history of the junks, and then he chronicled 10 of them, but they're all fairly recent, not anything back in the 1850s. So he has a list of about 14. I've told him I think that maybe some of them are the same junk that may have landed in several different locations before it finally either met its demise or however it ended its story. they came across the Pacific. They came across the Pacific and they came to Gold Mountain. So when people don't leave home just because, all right? Immigration is a thing, we in the trade call it a push-pull. There has to be a pull, there should be, and there has to be a push. And China was in a mess in the 1840s. And so there was reason to go. Chinese never, look, it's the Middle Kingdom. It's the center of the earth. Why would they want to go anywhere? It's already there. Thousands of years of culture. There's an old saying, which by the way, there are a lot of Chinese sayings, and even if they're not, we make them up. The Chinese saying, let's see, 1 day at home is worth 1,000 days abroad. They didn't want to leave. And because they had divided their cultures into just two, there were Chinese and then barbarians, and when they left, they found out that, oh yeah, right, everybody is a barbarian, and it confirmed it. They just didn't leave by a whim. And certainly with families, which is really what makes this story so different. Because a lot of Chinese came, and they came in steamers and sailing ships to the Gold Mountain, right? These groups came as families, which the first time I saw some of the photographs that came out of the Point Alonis village, I literally just went, what? Because there were kids in the photographs, and all the other places where you see groups of Chinese, it's all guys, no families, no children. It was so startling. So I got into the census and got it confirmed by, wow. So they came across, and a lot of the story isn't corroborated. We have no evidence. All we have is the families saying that it's so. Well, I've heard it so often from so many different angles in these. First time I heard it, I didn't believe it. Ben Hong, who was one of the grandchildren, lived up in New Monterey, and he said, well, my great-grandparents came across in a junk and wrecked on the beach at Carmel. Yeah, right. Yeah, man, I didn't believe it. Mr. Van Tilburg makes it very clear that that's a universal response. And there has a tinge of cultural superiority in the response. Well, they couldn't have done that. Well, when you start looking at the history of it, it's almost like they could not have not done it. Does that make any sense? Not too many negatives, never mind. So let me make a pitch for the museum. Now, if you see it, you see the title, right? Pacific Grove Natural History Museum. And for some time, I was always a little bit riled up about that. I believe that the separation between cultural and natural history is artificial. And it's not useful, not at all. And I go on and on with my marine science friends, of whom I have very few, but who I do talk to from time to time. And I say, don't you understand that if you put humans outside the game, you have no chance to change the game. If all they've ever done is bad things, then you're giving them no credit. There's no hope for the future. You might as well quit. So I walked into the aquarium in the 70s. That's the 1970s, not the 1870s. You might look like it, but no, the 1970s, when they were first doing it. And I said, this is very interesting. What are you doing about the fishermen? And Steve Webster, who was one of the guiding people, wonderful man, marine scientist, said, whoa. I mean, it was like I hit him with a brick. He said, whoa, fisherman. I said, yeah, interesting. The place you're putting your aquarium, right outside. Fishermen, right there. Lots of them. Oh, well, write a report for us, and then we'll consider it. And Mr. Packard said, we don't have time for history. He said it in a meeting, right there. We may have to edit that part out, but he said it in a meeting. And all we got was a felucca hanging on the upper railing. That's the only thing we could intrude. The historical, the rest of it was fish and stuff. And so I worked hard. I worked really hard on this because the second floor had a window, still does, that looks right down on where the village was. It's going to be really simple. Just put a picture there. It doesn't have to be, interactive and any of that. Just a photograph and put an arrow so that people could see what was out there in the past. Jerry pulled it off. I didn't. I couldn't. I had surrendered. But intruding the human history into just something like that made it really, really, it drove me nuts. So they came across the way the story works, the story that I believe, and it doesn't matter whether I believe it or not, the family believes it, and their descendants believe it, okay. Came across, overshot, ended up down at Baja, down in Mexico, and then eventually came up. And that's not easy work, going up the coast, up north. And finally wrecked on the beach at the mouth of the Carmel River. And that's the bare bones. It's the second part of it that makes it really wondrous. They were rescued by indigenous people and taken to their village. When I have to say, when I first heard that, I went, yeah, whoa, really? Really? And what makes it all happen, and I don't want to say believable, but certainly is that the woman that was born there in 1859 spoke 5 languages. And one of them was the Indian language, the Rumsian language of the local Indians. 5. And as that story began to evolve, it became more and more. And so what I'm going to describe to you tonight is the story that might have been had things been just a little different. If you went to the museum, and you should, by the way, they have, in my view, the best exhibit on the village, on the Point Alonis village, the big Chinese village over here in PG, I've ever seen. I couldn't even imagine it. And I'm looking with critical eye, and saying, well, boy, is it good. And so the title on the door says Pacific Grove Natural History Museum. It's a lie. They've got humans in there. And they've got the human history. They already had the native people in there, but now they've got the Chinese in there. They are to be congratulated beyond belief and supported. But in there's also a little exhibit about the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which is going to play a part in the story that I'm going to tell you now. So let's go to another picture and see what it is. Okay, that is a junk. That's a coastal junk that worked along the California coast. The junk that they came in fact, I checked with Hans. I said, Hans, I sent him this picture. He said, no way. No way. It's too small. It's got no, covering. No. He's a nice coastal junk, but no. The best thing I've seen, I saw today. In fact, he doesn't even have a good photograph in here of the 1850s junks that we're coming across, is the model that they have in the museum. It's sweet, and it's large enough. But the thing, all you have to do is get in the water. You can go from China to California and not want to. Fishing floats. The current just brings you around. So, go next. Now, this leads me to a subject that's really important to me, and that is that the Chinese came here with a fully developed view of the world. And they divided it into two parts. There was the not edible, which were rocks. And then there was the edible, which was everything else. Because they came from an experience where they learned over the thousands of years that if you're pushed to it, you can eat anything. This caused them an enormous range of experience. Because a lot of the people who came here from the other direction had a very narrow view. Very narrow. One of the stories, and it was Ben Hong again, I had about 3 or 4 people that I would take photographs to and say, what's going on here? So this is one of them. For those of you that don't recognize them, those are sea urchins as big as basketballs. I mean, they're huge. And they when they're alive and down in the water, they got spines sticking out. If you put the spines on those puppies, okay. So I said, Ben, how did you eat them? How did they cook them? What did you put them in? And he said, talking to the stupid Irishman, he said, no, you see, they're already in. No cook, don't cook, no, cook, no, they're in. You get a spoon and you find the roe and you eat that raw as soon as you can because it goes bad really fast. Urchin roe was a delicacy. Of course it was. And I said to Ben, oh, stupid me. Because each time you come to one of these places, if you talk to the ancestors, the living ones, and ask, you find out stuff. What a concept. What an incredible concept. So the other one, I'll hold up, and I'm embarrassed by this, by the way. I'm embarrassed because it's so small. This is an abalone. To the people who lived here, except for the native peoples, and they knew, they had the same vision that Chinese immigrants had, which was, yeah, you can use that. You can make it work. But for most people, this was just a big snail. And if you just say it that way, say, well, abalone is just a big snail. But that's what it is. And to make it work, if you're on this coast and you're going to try to start a business, you want to be able to move it. If you have a handshake like a dead fish, that's not a good thing. A dead fish is not a good thing, all right? And the longer it's been dead, the less of a good thing it is. And we're more than a dead fish away from the markets in San Francisco, across the Pacific, well, certainly across the Pacific. So there's got to be a way. And of course, the Chinese knew the way. It's very simple. Well, it's not simple. You harvest the animal, you cut the viscera off. There's some stuff down there around the edges that you don't want, but you want the muscle. This animal has been doing push-ups all of its life. That muscle is you wish you had muscles like that, all right? I mean, you pop your shirt open. I mean, you'd really be going. And so what they did is they dried them, but you had to process them first. And it was about a 6 or 7 step process. You boiled them, you processed them, you boiled them again, and then eventually you put them out in the sun and you dried them. By now, they're like what one person described as a leather doorknob, because they're solid. Hockey puck might be another possible metaphor. But in that shape, you could ship them across the Pacific, because that's where the market for leather doorknobs, disguised as abalones, was. Because what they did there was they would shave them down and make soup stock out of them. Seems like a lot of trouble to go to get soup stock, but that's what they did. That's where the market was. There wasn't enough market here. There was no market here to speak of, because the indigenous people had been removed, as had been the sea otters. When the Chinese first saw this place, clear water. You got clear water here. And all they had to do was look down and go, yikes. Because the abalone were everywhere, crawling out of the rocks and up the streets. And I mean, it's just an incredible thing. Big as manhole covers. Well, they didn't have manhole covers then, but you understand. So they hit them, and they hit them hard. 1853 is usually the date that we use. When the abalone hunters, they went to the gold fields and they got beat up. And they learned early on that this wasn't it. This wasn't going to be the land of opportunity here. We got to find something else to do. Many of them were fishermen. They knew about abalone because they have the abalone on that side, but they're all about the size of a quarter, because a lot of population had worked them pretty hard. Nobody had been working them here. But they worked them down to low tide, but they didn't go any farther. I have no examples. And boy, I've looked for any of the Chinese fishermen on this side diving. They didn't dive. I don't know why, except for the fact that the water is so damn cold. I mean, even the Japanese, when they came in and dove, they sent their little cotton things back and said, send some suits. This water is really cold. And it is. It's about 17, 20 degrees colder than that side of the Pacific. So they stopped, leaving for the next group, which would be the Japanese who come in the late 90s, to harvest the abalone. But they did use a glass bottom box with a hook on it, on a long pole, so that they could go a little deeper. But basically, they didn't go any farther than that with the abalone. So go next. Let's see okay, here we are. This is the setup, and this is really kind of important geography for you. You are somewhere over here at the moment. Here's Point Lobos. Here's Pescadero. That's what it was called, just to confuse people in San Mateo County that have their own Pescadero. And then there's the Point Alones Village and also Maccabee Beach up at the top. This story that I'm working on with you tonight is here. It's in Carmel Bay. The junk wrecked here, maybe. We don't know. Doesn't matter. It's somewhere around here. All right? Where the village was, the indigenous people's village, we don't know for sure. That doesn't matter either, really, specifically. But what does matter is somewhere in 1854, 55, there is a small Chinese village right here, right above what is now called Whalers Cove, right in there. I'll show you the map in a second. So what happens here is that small village families, and also a small village up on top families. The migration generally will work from south this way to this way and ultimately to this way. The Kwok family is here, is a major player in this one. The Jung family is a major player at Pescadero, and I'll show you all that in a second. And then ultimately, those that haven't gone up to San Francisco, you have to understand the cultural draw is so important that it's like a magnet. San Francisco, both San Francisco side and also East Bay, pull a lot of Chinese and even first-born American Chinese up into the Bay, as the places where they are become a little less friendly. But this is not a story about unfriendliness. This is a story, and I can't overemphasize this so much. This is a story about the people who did the right thing. This is a story about the way it can work when the conditions are right. And for about 25 years, Carmel Bay was an oasis. An oasis where a little girl could be born in the Point Lobos village in 1859 and grow up in this culture that surrounds Carmel Bay with absolute access to everyone and everything, without fear. The Chinese have a sort of a metaphor that the empire's at peace when a woman can have a golden nugget on her head and walk from one end of the empire to the other with safety. That's when the empire is at peace. This place was at peace when a young Chinese girl could grow up with a Chinese face on the top of her body without fear, and in fact, to be welcomed. She got the name Spanish Mary. They called her Spanish Mary because they had expected Chinese words to come out of her mouth. They were startled when the first words that came out of her mouth, because she was hanging out in a very Spanish language place, was Spanish. I don't know of another Chinese female that grew up in California that was called Spanish. They were all called China Mary. They had, different nicknames because people couldn't handle the names. Spanish Mary, 5 languages. She roamed this place. She grew up here as part of the country. The gente del país. Her language was a little rough. We had a photograph of Kwok Mui on the wall at the whaler's cabin. And we identified her as Spanish Mary, but the photograph had another Chinese name on the back. So we just put it up. But docents at Point Lobos are trained that if anything happens, you throw a net over them and you get their name and address, all right? One day, a woman walked into the building and said, "That's my grandmother." Spanish Mary was her nickname, but that's not her Chinese name. They threw a net over her, and we got her name and address, and within a week, I was on the floor of her living room in San Francisco. Her name was Mary Lee, and she became my window for her grandmother, because she came down from the city every summer and spent the summer with her. And one of the reasons she talked about the language was she would go with her grandmother and she would visit her old buddies all around, Carmel, south of Carmel pretty much. And Mary would go with her, and she would overhear the language, the things that were spoken, and she picked up some Spanish. But then when she went home, and her parents, who knew some Spanish as well, knocked her off the chair the first time and said, we don't say that in public. She had learned a whole different kind of Spanish and a whole different, these girls are sitting around talking story. We wouldn't understand anything they were saying, but can you imagine this? Her old buddies from the old days, right? She ended up living at 774 Wave Street, and eventually, passed away here in 1936. So let's see what I loaded. I have no idea. If there's a naked person, get it out of there. Okay, so here's the deal. The thing about Point Lobos is we have a succession of people coming in to work it. It's natural resource rich. And just about the same time that she's growing up, there's a group that came in here, and if you see this is not a natural formation right here. This is a cliff, this is a quarry. It was a granite quarry from roughly 52 to about 57, 58, 1852 to 57, 58. All right, this is before she was born, before Kwok Mui was born, but the Chinese village is there. And the sketch person who did this, you wanted to say, go a little more left. I want to see a little more left. I got to see, because there's a whole row of buildings there. And some of those are where the Chinese live. But it was the granite quarry that provided the setup for a lot of other things that came. Go next. Okay. This is a United States Geological Survey map from 58, 59. And don't be confused by the names. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, where's the beach? Where's the candy store? Where's all the stuff there that we expect to see? Where's the $2 million garage that you can buy? No, actually, what you just saw, that indentation is up. You see it up at the top. That's the old granite quarry. And then the name Carmel was all over this country. This was Carmel. That's why you've got Carmel the C. That's why they did that. They did that because locals would confuse, they knew where Carmel was. This was Carmel. Not up there, where it is now. And when they subdivided it, they made sure it was Carmel City and then Carmel the C. And by the way, it's in the ordinance in the city. You have to say all the hyphens. It has to be Carmel the C. So right here, it says Chinese fishery. God bless you, the American government. And there's the buildings all lined up. And there's a lot. Look at the buildings. They're all over here. That's because, and here's the key to the story, the title to the land was in court. Nobody owned anything. There was a thing called the Land Commission, and you were supposed to, after the statehood, to take it up to the Land Commission and verify it. And the Land Commission rejected the first applicant who went up there. So all of a sudden, it meant that it might be public domain someday. So all you got to do is build something and live in it, and then be there when it becomes declared public domain. It means that everybody who lives here, everybody is a squatter. And what that does is that means that nobody's winning. They're all equal. And they've got to keep their heads down, and they just got to mind their business. And this creates the level playing field upon which Kwok Mui grew up, and her brothers, and the Jungs on the other side. All of the land around Carmel Bay was in litigation. They're all working on hope. hoping that the land will ultimately be thrown into public domain, which meant that you could homestead it and get clear title. Clear title. You pay a fee. You may not have bought a house lately, but there's a thing called a title insurance company. Very important in the history of California. I don't even know if they have title insurance companies in Iowa, but they sure got them here. And it's a legacy of this period when the Yankees were taking on the grant titles and scrambling everything up. So nobody had it. Either they all had it or nobody had it. So, next. We think, well, we're not sure, that Chinese may have lived in that building. They did an archaeological survey. They picked up the building and mined it underneath, found a whole bunch of Chinese stuff. It's hard to date exactly when it was constructed. It is known as Whaler's Cabin, the cabin, and it's the only building, actually on what is now the reserve, that the state didn't tear down in 1933 when they took over the property. The natural beauty was so strong that the state was convinced that this was going to be a natural reserve. And here it comes. It's just like I was talking about with the museum. They wiped out the human history. Wiped it out. Remember all those little dots? Gone. The only thing they couldn't wipe out was the quarry, because that's granite, solid up and down. In there is probably one of the best condensed exhibits you will ever see anywhere, because we're stuffing as much history as you can barely lift into that little tiny building. And that was a building where Mary Lee went in and said, no, that's my grandmother. Next. And that's her grandmother. So we got to know about Kwok Mui from Mary and Ben and others who we eventually tracked down. And she married, I'm going to miss the date, but she's married before this story ends, the story of the Chinese village here. Next. That's Mary Lee. That's Mary Lee back in the 80s when she was willing to talk to me on her living room floor. And who just, to spend her summers, some of us were fortunate enough to spend summers with our grandmothers, at least for a bit of the summer. Mine was in the Butno up in San Mateo County. I treasure that, but I wasn't that interested in German history and Irish history, so I was interested in fishing. Fortunately, Mary didn't have that, and she paid attention. Next. Husband, Joan, usually anglicized Jone, and Chinese immigrant. Now, what's interesting about this is that it's a good thing they were married in the 19th century, because in the 20th century, the law was passed that if a native-born American citizen married an immigrant, particularly an immigrant ineligible for citizenship, the native-born U.S. citizen lost their citizenship. Lost their citizenship. And I'm sure many of you have examples of family members where that happened. And at the time they got married, they just got married. Nobody came and said, well, if you get married, we're going to take away. No, they found out later. And then they had to go naturalize and to explain to the judge in the naturalization process, when the judge always asked, tell us the country of your birth, and they would say, the United States of America, and the judge would go, what? And then somebody would have to explain to the judge that, no, you see, there was this law, there weren't enough historians around, I guess. Okay, next. Sad thing that Mary talked about, because her grandfather, Kwakmoy's husband, lost his eyesight. And it could have been glaucoma, could have been cataracts, we're not sure, but he went blind. And this is a photograph of him at that stage. And she said that every year, she would go down in the summer, Mary would, to visit her grandparents. He would line the grandchildren up against the wall and go along and feel their faces and see how tall they were compared to the year before. That ain't in no history books, kids. That's the kind of stuff that the people can tell us if we listen. Next. Oh, this is the very famous photograph. This was taken at 774 Wave Street, and it was taken by Mary Lee. And she said, take a look at the angle, because Mary was a little girl, and she had a Brownie camera. And so the camera is right about belly button level. And her grandmother dressed up, which she very often didn't, and came out and posed for Mary, so that we've got this photograph. And one of the characteristics of 774 Wave is the shingles. It's a shingled building. Very special place for some of us. Next. As often happens, but you think about what the permutations, combinations, and probabilities are, if you've got children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and if the natural order of things occurs, you end up with a whole lot of people. This was taken at Vasona Park, Lake Vasona over in Los Gatos. And you can't see it, but the photograph of the grandfather and Kwakmoy are in front of them. And I'm sure that not everybody showed up, right? That's a large, large group of people. And many of them have connections to this village, because just to finish the story, she moved with her husband to the Pescadero village, north, and then ultimately they moved to the Point Alonis village. And eventually she ends up on 774 Way Street. So, yeah, next. And there is the descendant that helped do everything for us, everything that's going to happen tomorrow. It's Jerry. Jerry used a phrase, and I think I've got it right, gentle trouble. The problem is, I'm not gentle trouble. I'm just trouble. And so she worked. It was like water wearing away stone. She would just work, and she had incredible patience. And about every 6 months, I would check in and I would say, how's it going with the Feast of Lanterns? How's it going with the aquarium? How's it going with the walk? How's it going? And she was always positive, always upbeat, and much more, how shall I say, polite than I would have ever been. So let me tell you about the Feast of Lanterns. And then we'll do the Jungs. I know we've got Jungs here. I want to make sure I get to them. But I first hit that story in the late 70s, 1970. And when I first hit it, when I was first doing the research, and I grew up in Hollister, I kind of went around here. I knew about Pacific Grove. I knew that the first place you could buy a beer was at Incaviglia's liquor store, right on the other side of the city limits, and that's how you knew when you were in Pacific Grove or in Monterey, because you could buy a beer in Monterey and you couldn't buy a beer in Pacific Grove, which always seemed a little weird to me, but nevertheless. So I hit the Feast of Lanterns. I actually hit it in the record. I hit the account in 1905, and then I began to see what the Feast of Lanterns had become. I said a few things, but this honky hay baler Well, what does he know, right? And particularly in an issue where it was a matter of embarrassment. I mean, I was embarrassed about it, to be quite candid. I was embarrassed for Chinese Americans and Chinese people. It was just an embarrassment. But I had a dog in that hunt, but I wasn't gonna be successful. And I discussed it with people in Pacific Grove, and they said, well, we do it, we raise money and, yada, yada. And then I found out, of course, that the story of this cockamamie thing where she jumps in the water and came from a plate, a Staffordshire piece of pottery. It actually came from England, and my Irish stuff got going right there. I thought, my God, they're stealing stories. Or good, you can go ahead and steal English stories. We don't care. So I backed off. But I monitored, I watched, because it had to come from the community, the affected community. I felt affected. I invited some of the guys that I knew up in San Francisco. One of them was Alex Hing, who had formed an organization called the Red Guard. And I said, Alex, they're doing some things down in Pacific Grove you really ought to know about. And he said, well, yeah, what? And I said, well, they're dressing up like princesses. They're using Scotch tape on their eyes. And they've got this story that's not true. And then he looked at me and he said, we got important things to do up here. We got people to feed. We got organizing to do. And he said, we'll get to it maybe someday. Because I thought this was made to order for, the sort of cultural expropriation that it really was. But they continued to do it, and they continued to do it, and then COVID. I'm going to give COVID a little credit here, because COVID shut it down. COVID shut it down and gave the history a chance to breathe, and gave many people that are here a chance to finally express to the city of Pacific Grove their concern, their hurt, because it hurt. So I think part of my job, if I have one, is to see if we can find a path through this, where, I've sent emails to Kathy after after the city council said they were going to do it and do an apology, and I said, now you gotta back off. You don't humiliate the defeated. It's an old samurai thing. You just don't. It's an old baseball thing. You don't show them up. You don't show them up. You're getting what you wanted. Let's look for some good in here. And I think I found some, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute. And God bless Jerry Lowe, Sabato. We miss her, and I'm sure Randy probably misses her more than any of us ever could. And I want to thank Randy for loaning her to us, for letting her do that, what she did. I can't imagine. I just can't imagine, because I was only on the outside. Amazing stuff. Okay, next. All right, let's go on the other side of the bay. This is Pescadero Point. You know it as the 17th green. All right, for those of you that you need your orientation that way. This is now known as Pebble Beach. It was called Pescadero. You can see the Pescadero rock right here. Pescadero means fisherman's place, which suggests that people fished there before, during the Spanish and Mexican era. Sure they did. It's a great place. Nice place to have a picnic. Wonderful view, warm. It's on the south-facing side. But you can see it, and you can see the buildings if you can see that far. The buildings were all up in here and right down in there. Next. And there it is from the air. That picture was taken in 1985 for the cover of the first Chinese Gold. And there's the beach club, right there. And that's right in there was where a gentleman named Jung San Choi eventually had a family and started a little village which is now, of course, the Pebble Beach and the 18th Greens over there on the left. Next. Jung San Choi, So Young was his wife, had 13 children. She was 50 years old when she gave birth to her 13th child. We're talking tough people here, man. This is something. I got to meet the 13th child. He was known in the family as Baby Bert because he was the baby of the family. I think we've got him coming in a minute. But what Jung San Choi did, and here's what makes this Chinese stuff so much fun, is he figured out a way to make a living. Fishing, not so good. It gets messy. But something changed. And it changed in 1880, which is the big year around here. In 1880, they built the Hotel Del Monte. And the Pacific Improvement Company and the Southern Pacific Railroad laid out a road that went around the peninsula and was exactly, at that time, how many miles? 17 miles. It's not now, by the way. And I have, on occasion, when I feel ornery, asked the guy when I'm leaving at the other end of it, I only got 14.2. What do I get, a discount or something? He said, you're lying here. This ain't 17 miles. And the guy, and usually there's cars behind me, and they said, just get going. Okay, next. There's the original Hotel Del Monte. That one burned up. And the second and third one, of course, ended up being the Naval Postgraduate School. And you can see, and you are in the far distance in that drawing. But tourists are the same everywhere. I take people across the sea. You heard this, right? We go everywhere. Mongolia, it doesn't matter. And the first thing that they want to do is they want to buy something. My people want to buy. Even though I've sort of beat them up about this, it doesn't matter. It's a compulsion. The visitors have. Tourists have. They've got to buy something. What the Pacific Improvement Company did, they had a hotel full of tourists that needed to have something to do. You couldn't just sit and drink mint juleps in the afternoon in the nicely graveled garden. Had to have something to do. So they took them on tours on the 17-mile drive. And the 17-mile drive went right through the village over here at Point Alonis and came around the corner, came around all the thing. There was a Chinese shepherd up there who never really got into the monetary part of it. And then they went around, went through Pescadero. Then they went to the mission. That's what motivated them finding Sarah. They didn't know where Sarah was. And they did some probing, and eventually they thought they found him, and eventually used that as a tourist bait to get him to come by the mission and then eventually go back to the hotel. When they went past Jung San Choi's village and his house, next, they had a souvenir stand. And he used the kids. He's got eventually 13 of them, right? He's got a lot of help. They polished the abalone shells. They strung up the little sea urchins. And they became a fixture on the 17-mile drive. They became part of the economy. They became part of this place. They became important to the Pacific Improvement Company. he charged them 50 cents a month rent. They charged Jung San Choi for his house, his garden, and his barn 50 cents a month. We're talking 17-mile drive here, folks. I mean, this is, and because he was part of it. There are people who say, well, that's exploitation. That's kind of like the Feast of Lanterns in a way. No. What it gave him was security. He could make a living. His kids had something to do. Both sides of the bay, both sides of Carmel Bay. Kwak Moi could walk unmolested. Jung San Choi was able to stay there. Later in his life, he eventually went back. He only went to China once. He came from Hong Kong, and he went back, I think 1904 or 5, somewhere in there, before the earthquake. No, it was after the earthquake, actually, 1907. And but by then he was ill, and he had stomach cancer, we found out later, and then eventually he came back and passed away here. And the timing is critical. Remember those land titles? You've forgotten about them already, but look back in your notes. Right there you said land titles. The land titles all began to be resolved a little before and a little after the turn of the century. So that means that development is coming. Whether you see development and developers as a bad word, I think is kind of unfortunate. It doesn't help when we're trying to. You've got to see history neutrally. Let it breathe and just don't be so quick to judge. Don't take all your current values and transport them back there yet. That's not going to get us anywhere. What we want to know the story. And eventually, 1987, the Jungs had a reunion. They said, can you make arrangements with the Pebble Beach Company? Can we come to the beach club or somewhere where the house was? And I said, sure, are you kidding? So they came down, it must be almost 100 of them at that time. That picture was taken, and you can see the beach club behind. Hold on, you can flip it. The buildings on the left are the Chinese village. This is the 17-mile drive, and in those, you see those cypress trees sticking up? In the distance, those were planted by Jung San Choi. Next. Oh, that's better. Okay, now you get a chance to see, and right in the middle, where he belongs, baby Bert, right here. The last of the 13, he was born right there. I gave a talk in the meeting room, and there was a moment to help orient the family as to where they were, and one of them put up their hand, and she said, "We're not leaving." And the Pebble Beach staff that were there, they all kind of hunkered down and went, "Oh my God, we're going to have a demonstration or something." And then she put her hand back up and said, "Just kidding." Sense of humor. Next. This is really, it's my younger brother over here on the left, but there's baby Bert, and there was my connection to the squid industry. That's Margaret Lamb, who had the last squid drying company in the Monterey Bay region. In fact, and it was over in Seaside, because the squid drying migrated, because of the odor, eventually ended up in Seaside. Sorry if you're from Seaside, but that's just where things end up. And there we are having, this will be 1987, so what is that, 35 some years ago? The tie is the signature. I always do that. It just, if you see me without the tie, it means I'm off duty. All right, next. All right. Let's just set up the cosmology and give you a solution to the situation that exists now. The cosmology is that There is no real organized Chinese, quote, religion, unquote. Bits and pieces here and there, but most of the religion centers and the spirituality centers on the spirits. And after you pass away, your spirit could go many different places. Could go to heaven, or there's multi-leveled hell. But the deal is that they have a lot to do with what happens here now to you. And the way the system works is that the responsibility rests with the living to take care of the ancestors. All right? That's the deal. Every region, every village has its different systems, and you can get lost in those. Don't get lost in it. Because if the family doesn't take care of its responsibilities for respecting and honoring the ancestors, the spirits become hungry ghosts. And hungry ghosts are bad news. Hungry ghosts you don't want. There's too many hungry ghosts in the world right now, folks. They're everywhere. And what they do is they take out, they can have to do with, whether you win the lottery or not. Trust me, if you're not taking care of them, you won't. Better to be born lucky than clever. Luck is it. And luck is engineered by the spirits. You do good things here, you may get good luck in response. Probably won't be direct, never is. Maybe 6 generations later, somebody will win the lottery, you won't. So what's happening in that photograph? Well, most of the Chinese who died here died without family. And they were terrified that they would die without family. That is the worst thing. To be an orphan, because that's what that means. To be an orphan is the worst thing. To not have your family there to take care of your spirit once you've passed away. So they set up a spiritual insurance system. You won't find that in the... But if you Google Bone Pickers, California, my website comes up because I've got a piece on there that is a ripper. And I didn't realize that if you stay long enough, Google gives you points for hanging around a long time. I was astonished. I thought maybe somebody else had done something about this. So here's the deal. You pass away, they have a funeral ceremony, but there will be a Chinese section in the cemetery where you will be interred. The Chinese section is easy to find. You find the center of the cemetery, and you walk as far as you can to the outer fence. Walk around the outer fence, you'll find the Chinese section of the cemetery. Because people who don't have lunch together aren't buried together. All right? But it didn't matter to them. What's the matter? Because they're not staying. Because 10 years later, and there's these ledger books in San Francisco. The Chinese 6 companies knows everything. When you came in as a male Chinese without family or anything, you paid a fee. Of course you did. I mean, you paid, God knows how many fees you had to pay. And you'd be in debt. You thought student loans were terrible. I mean, these guys could never get their debts taken care of and get back. But you wanted to have insurance that your spirit would not be untended. So you paid the fee. They then buried you in a wooden, very simple, plain wooden coffin, because it isn't going to be there forever. And they put up a wooden grave marker, wooden, whitewashed with some Chinese characters on it. 10 years later, they'd come back in teams of what were known as bone pickers, hired by the 6 companies. And they would come into the cemeteries and they would exhume you. They'd measure the femur. They didn't build a box until they knew how big it had to be. That is so wonderfully Chinese. I hate to say it, but it's like no wasted effort here. No wasted wood. By God, we're going to get it. All right, the femur is it. We build a box. Then we painstakingly take every bone in that internment and you put it in a box. And what makes this photograph so wonderful is you can see the whole thing. He's down now to not many, but on the cover of the box is the name and the village, because he comes with the records that the Chinese 6 companies has. You know, during the anti-communist thing during the 50s, the FBI went after the Chinese 6 companies, big time, because they thought all Chinese were communists and we got to do something about this. And the 6 companies simply said, you come after us, we're going to burn them. Don't waste your time. And they stood them off. They kept the FBI away, which is, you know, there's some mythology about the 6 companies, but they're big time strong organization. Okay. So they put him in a box, put his name and address on there. And then they, you know, in this particular one, maybe there were 40 or 50 that had to be exhumed about every 10 years. That's how long the meat takes to go away. You don't want to ship the body. It's heavy. And it doesn't, you know, you don't just need the bones. The bones would go back to the village, to the ancestral hall, if there was one, in an urn, and be in the bosom of the family. Be in the bosom of the family for all time. But the wooden grave markers would fall down, vandalized. Sometimes they just, you know, people set fire to the cemetery just for fun. So what they would do, not a lot of expense here. They would take a brick, and they would carve in the brick the family name. They'd actually take 2 bricks, one at the head and one at the foot. It's like a dog tag. It's like an ID. So that all they had to do was find the grave, which they often did using probes. They'd go around the Chinese section. They would get the brick, look at the records that they had, know that Ginyik, well, unfortunately, and they would actually draw right in ink the name of the village. So that they, you know, the bone pickers would look it up, and they would they'd go on a ship, and they'd be shipped 10,000 a year boxes of bones heading to China. In 1949, Mao said, no more bones. We got a revolution to do here. No more bones. So they ended up in a warehouse in Hong Kong. In fact, a couple of them. But the feast is in August, and it's known as the Hungry Ghost Festival. The hungry ghosts come back, the ghosts come back to Earth for about a month. This year it's the 12th, I think, of August. They have a celebration. It's a real Chinese celebration. It's celebrated all over the world. Wherever there were overseas Chinese, they celebrated the Hungry Ghost Festival. And what it does is it honors the ancestors. There may be a situation where the family no longer exists, or they can't find him, or there's a way that if everybody celebrates, They can take care of the hungry ghosts that have no family. This is an amazing, amazing festival. Why not? Doesn't have to be. And there are lanterns in case you need lanterns. If that's what you need, if that's what somebody needs, why not honor? Why not honor the ancestors? Tie it to here. Now let me just tell you where this brick came from. This brick came from Santa Cruz. The Santa Cruz Chinese cemetery has almost no one in it because Chinese didn't raise families historically. They do now, thank goodness, but not before. So there were a lot of single guys that were buried in that cemetery that were exhumed. And of course, you maybe even did it yourself when you're looking at that photograph going, as you know, my lovely wife, as I described to her how you eat sea urchins raw on the way over here, she almost drove off the road. She said, what? And she's been around a bit, and I'm surprised. How many of you have eaten sea urchin raw? Oh, I expected more hands. Okay. You'll have to explain it to them sometime to get a chance. But I don't know where I left that. I left that with the wrong thing. Santa Cruz. Because Santa Cruz because most of them were guys, they were exhumed. I took a class over there in 1974. I took them to the cemetery to clean up the Chinese section of Evergreen Cemetery in Santa Cruz. And these bricks were laying all over the ground. They didn't need the brick anymore. They tossed it aside and got the guy in the box and sent him off to his ancestors. Monterey is blessed. Monterey is different. And a lot of you represent. I don't know if you've ever seen, I don't know if I left it out. I should have left it out. The genealogy of the Kwok family stretches for yards, hundreds of people. Kwok Mui is buried here. Of course she is. Of course she is. She helped raise her granddaughter. There's a whole generation, 2, 3, to take care of her spirits. You're lucky. And that's kind of what makes Monterey different. What makes Monterey different, and in some ways Pacific Grove, but I'm going to blow the kiss to Monterey particularly, with its multicultural historical background. Anti-Chinese stuff didn't stick. God bless you all for coming. George is coming. George is coming. The very George that I just mentioned, George Isles Jr., who grew up here, an MPC.
Come over here, Sandy. Okay, let's go right in. Come on, Sandy. I did go to Monterey High, class of 1960, and I grew up 2 blocks from Jerry Lo Sabato. That's what happens when you get old. I want to thank Sandy. Sandy is so terrific. Sandy changed my life in Santa Cruz. He's changing your lives here. His work, getting the word out. In Santa Cruz, I'm lucky because every year he would give these speeches and variations of them. They would be all different. And he would brainwash the people in thinking that the Chinese were heroic, hardworking, been around here forever sort of thing, and that people are lucky to have them. It matters who tells our story. It matters who tells your story. And we are so lucky to have Sandy tell our story. It's changed the world, and he keeps changing it. Thank you, Sandy.
Oh, thank you, Sandy. I know it's getting late, but I think we have some time for some questions.
If they dare, have them come up.
Okay. Okay, yeah, if you can come up.
I think the key thing that Professor Lydon, I'll call him Professor Lydon, said is that he listened to Mary. That was the key thing. And we need to get all Americans to listen to us about our stories. But you have to tell the story. You have to be like Mary Lee with him. You have to be willing to tell the story. Oral history is going to be key to get our history, because guacamole is just one of many stories. And thank God we have that going now, and that's what tomorrow's about. But there can be walks like that everywhere about our people. So I think that's really important. Professor Lydon to the Chinese American community is a gem, because who had the patience to sit with Mary? You know, I don't know how many times you did that, but that's really what it was about. And that's a real historian. That's people's history. So that's what it's about. And I love his book, his Chinese Gold. Everybody here should buy that. Who's not going to buy that here? You're all going to buy it, right? Send him a $20 check. Thank him for his tremendous decades of 1970s. You know, in 1969, we went on strike at UC Berkeley. I mean, he found ethnic studies, right? He was already doing it. And Himmak Lai told him, Sandy, you need to write the book about the Monterey Bay. And he did, because the Historical Society needed it. And that's what it's about. So thank you so much, Professor.
Any other questions, comments? Question?
I was just wondering, you talk about the men, the bones of the men going back to China.
Yes.
What about the women?
Well, that's a really good question. But if there were women here and families had resulted, which in most cases they did, they wouldn't have to. That Kwakmoy is in the cemetery. In fact, I think I have Kwakmoy. Put her up here. Let me see. No, the other way. Go. Yeah. This is the Chinese section of the San Carlos Cemetery, and one more. There she is. The San Carlos Cemetery. It's by El Estero. Yeah, I mean, that's not. Yeah, the main road that you come in and on, you go by a thing that looks like a big park, and it's at the back of that. You just ask people. It is a wondrous cemetery, not just because of this. All of Monterey is there. You can go talk to them. I talk to them all the time. Fortunately, most of them don't talk back. But to answer the question, that's an interesting question, because there were a few, not many, single females who had been brought here for other than family purposes, all right? They're prostitutes. And actually, in the census, the first time I hit the females in this village, they weren't all living together, which you could usually tell. They weren't making quilts or something. I mean, they were all together because there were a lot of men here. So when you saw the individual Chinese women scattered across the place, each with a husband and kids and so on, it meant different things. I'm not actually sure to answer that directly. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know how the 6 companies would handle that. This would be there's a PhD dissertation in there somewhere if you want to do it, honestly, because that is a question that's worth exploring. We know about the guys. Don't know, and I wish but will I live long enough? I don't know. Maybe I will. I'm not sure.
Any other questions? Well, let's do this one first and then one in the back.
So meanwhile, you can break radio silence and at the end of all of this, shout out what the score is. For those of us who have been deprived. No, I'll tell you what, if it's really bad, don't tell us.
Well, Sandy, just now you touched upon the Chinese luck and engineering thing. So I think I have something to share with you. The five levels of Chinese aspirations. The five Chinese levels of aspiration is number one, fate. Fate means that if you are born as a king, or you are born as the son of the king, you are the prince. Nothing can change that. And number two is luck, right? So if you win a lottery ticket, it's still not a king. And number three is feng shui. And then if you have good feng shui, it changes your life somewhat. And number four is you are smart. You're born smart. You can change things somewhat. And the last thing is to study hard. That change your life, but nothing like number one. If you're born, yeah, academic, yeah, study hard. Yeah, you can change your life somewhat, but then if you're born as the son of the king, it is unbeatable. So that's our 5 level of aspirations.
Thank you. And by the way, the Chinese imperial government, there was a track where you didn't have to be born into it. You could take an exam, a serious exam when you give it across the whole country. They had government, think about this, government functionaries in the bureaucracy who pass an exam to get there. What a concept. Think about what that would mean. It meant that scholarship was important. And the lottery ticket, which they invented, by the way, I don't know why the California lottery system doesn't do a little thing, but this is, the lottery is a form of Keno. And the Keno was a pakapu, was the white pigeon ticket. It was invented in China. And they had 80 numbers, but they weren't numbers, they were characters. The first 80 characters of the 1,000-character poem. There's a poem, the traditional Chinese poem, which for 1,000 characters, they didn't need to repeat any characters. 1,000, yeah, if you want to study Chinese, think about that. 1,000 characters. And it was those spots that they based the Keno game in Reno, in Nevada when it became legal, but out here they were doing it 100 years before, out in the rest of California. And Chinese families sometimes, when they went to numbers, they call them spots. I don't know if you ever thought about that, but they call them spots. But they were actually, because non-Chinese couldn't read them, so they gave them numbers so that they could do that. In the family will, they would will the numbers, the family numbers, because their belief was, if you stand still long enough, the pigeons will find you. But if you're out looking for the pigeons, then give it up. So I gave a class in this. God bless Cabrillo College, let me give a class in Keno. And in the class, what I was explaining was combination tickets and what the odds are and how to do it. And it was an older Chinese gentleman, God bless older Chinese gentlemen and younger Chinese gentlemen. And I said, the odds in this game are terrible. There are millions to 1 to hand went up. And I said, sir. And he said, no, they're not terrible. They're 50-50. Your ticket either wins or it loses. That is what I call an optimistic view. And that's why the lottery outlets in Chinatown are usually busier than anywhere else. But that's part of the whole construct. I loved what you said. And And we have some guys come over and do our house and said that we had to paint our front door red, okay, bright red. Now we're still troubled about that. I mean, we haven't done it yet, but I haven't won the lottery either. So, but I have had a chance to meet a whole bunch of wonderful people like you all. So thank you.